What if I told you the Silk Road was never lost? It was protected by the people who lived inside it. Hidden cities, forgotten empires, and silent guardians still shape the world you live in today. What if I told you there are cities that were never meant to be found? Places so valuable, so powerful, that they were protected not just by walls, but by silence, distance, and time itself? Cities where outsiders were watched, where knowledge was controlled, and where the line between welcome and warning was almost invisible. For centuries, these places stood hidden along the Silk Road, guarded not only by rulers, but by the people who lived within them. And once you step into their story, you realize something unsettling. They were never truly lost. They were kept. Long before modern borders divided the world, Central Asia was something entirely different. It was not empty land between civilizations. It was the center of them. A vast network of routes stretched across deserts, mountains, and valleys, connecting distant empires through movement and exchange. This was the Silk Road, but not as a single road. It was a living system, constantly shifting, constantly adapting, shaped by those who used it. And within that system, there were cities that stood apart, not because they were invisible, but because they were controlled. Places where entry was not always open, where information did not flow freely, where presence itself could be questioned. These were the so-called forbidden cities of Central Asia, not officially named as such, but defined by how they functioned. They were protected, but protection here did not always mean defense in the traditional sense. It meant something deeper. It meant controlling access, controlling knowledge, controlling who could enter, who could stay, and who could leave with information. Because along the Silk Road, information could be more valuable than any physical object. Silk, spices, gold, these were visible forms of wealth. But knowledge routes, alliances, technologies, ideas, this was power that could not be easily measured. And once it moved, it could not be taken back. That is why certain cities became more than just stops along a trade route. They became guardians of what passed through them. As the first light rises over the vast landscapes of Central Asia, the scale of this world begins to reveal itself. Endless deserts stretch toward the horizon, their surfaces shaped by wind and time. Mountains rise sharply in the distance, forming natural barriers that define where movement is possible and where it is not. Between these extremes, routes emerge, not marked by signs or borders, but by repetition, paths formed by countless journeys, reinforced over generations until they became known, trusted, and essential. But even these routes were not always safe. Bandits, shifting weather, political tensions, every journey carried risk. And that risk created a need for something more than just movement. It created a need for protection. Some of that protection came from geography. Harsh environments naturally limited who could pass through. Deserts could hide routes, mountains could restrict access, and distance itself could act as a barrier. But geography alone was not enough, because the most important protection came from people, communities that understood the value of what moved through their land, cities that recognized their position within the network, individuals who knew that survival depended not only on participation, but on control. These were the early guardians, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but always present. As the day begins, imagine the movement of a caravan approaching one of these cities. The journey has been long, the environment unforgiving. Supplies are limited, and the destination represents more than just rest. It represents opportunity. But arrival does not guarantee entry, because these cities did not exist only to serve travelers. They existed to manage them, to observe who arrived, to determine what they carried, to understand where they came from, and where they intended to go next. This was not suspicion, it was strategy, because every person entering the city brought something with them. Goods, yes, but also information, stories of distant lands, knowledge of changing routes, awareness of political shifts that could affect the entire network. And once that information entered a city, it became part of something larger, something controlled. Markets would open, goods would be exchanged, conversations would unfold. But beneath this visible activity, there was always an invisible layer, a system of awareness that tracked movement, monitored change, and preserved balance, because balance was everything. Too much openness could bring risk. Too much restriction could stop movement entirely. And without movement, the Silk Road could not exist. So these cities learned how to exist between those extremes, open enough to remain essential, controlled enough to remain secure. As the sun rises higher, the life within these cities begins to take shape. Streets fill with activity, but not chaos. Movement follows patterns, routines that have been refined over time. Every role within the city contributes to its function. Merchants, artisans, leaders, families, each one part of a larger system. And within that system, guardianship was not limited to a single group. It was shared. Some guarded through knowledge, others through observation, some through structure, others through tradition, but all contributed to the same goal: maintaining the integrity of the city within the larger network of the Silk Road. Because if one part failed, the entire system could weaken. As the light begins to shift toward afternoon, the scale of this responsibility becomes clearer. These were not isolated places. They were connected points within a vast and fragile network. Every decision made within them could influence routes that stretched across continents. Every choice could affect movement far beyond their walls. And that is what made them so important and so guarded. They were not just cities. They were control points of history itself. As the first chapter of this journey unfolds, one realization begins to take hold. The Silk Road was never only about where you could go. It was about where you were allowed to go. And the difference between those two ideas was controlled by the guardians of the forbidden cities. What if I told you there was a city so powerful, so brilliantly designed, that it didn't need to hide, yet still controlled everything that passed through it? A place where beauty wasn't just decoration, but strategy. Where knowledge wasn't just shared, but filtered. Where every traveler who entered left changed, but never with the full picture. This is Samarkand, a city that didn't just exist on the Silk Road. It quietly ruled it. Long before modern cities rose from glass and steel, Samarkand stood as something far more influential. It was not the largest city in the world, and it was not the most isolated, but it held something more important: control over connection. Because every major route across Central Asia seemed to pass through or near this place. Caravans carrying silk from the east, spices from the south, metals and goods from the west, all converged towards Samarkand. But what made the city unique was not just its location. It was how it managed what arrived. As the first light touches the city, its architecture begins to glow with a quiet intensity. Domes rise above the skyline, their surfaces reflecting shades of blue that shift with the sun. Patterns cover walls and structures, not randomly, but with precision. Geometry here is not decoration, it is language. A language that speaks of order, balance, and control. Walking into Samarkand does not feel overwhelming at first. The streets guide you inward, leading you toward open spaces that reveal the true scale of the city. And then, suddenly, it appears. The Registan, an open square surrounded by monumental structures, each one designed to command attention. But this space is not just for display. It is a center, a place where people gather, where ideas circulate, where presence is observed. Nothing here feels accidental. Every building, every pathway, every open space contributes to a larger system, one that was designed not only to impress, but to organize movement. Because in a city like Samarkand, movement had to be controlled. Too many travelers, too much information, too many unknown variables. Without structure, the system could collapse. So, the city became a filter. As the day begins, caravans enter the outer areas, slowing down as they approach the heart of the city. Goods are checked, interactions begin, and slowly, access is granted, but never completely unrestricted. Because Samarkand did not operate on openness alone, it operated on awareness. Every traveler carried more than goods. They carried knowledge, stories of distant lands, changes in trade routes, shifts in power that could influence entire regions. And within this city, that knowledge was not ignored. It was collected, not always in obvious ways. Conversations in markets, interactions between traders, exchanges in public spaces. All of it formed a network of information. And that network gave Samarkand its true power. Because when you understand movement, you understand influence. As the sun rises higher, the city reveals more of its identity. Schools and centers of learning stand alongside marketplaces. Scholars gather, not just to preserve knowledge, but to expand it. Mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. Ideas are studied, refined, and shared. But even here, within spaces dedicated to knowledge, there is structure. Not everything is accessible to everyone, because knowledge, like trade, must be managed. And this is where Samarkand becomes more than a city. It becomes a gatekeeper, deciding what moves forward and what stays behind. As you move through its streets, you begin to notice something subtle. There is a rhythm to the city, not rushed, not chaotic, but deliberate. Movement happens, but within boundaries that are not always visible. It is a balance between openness and control, allowing the city to function as a hub without losing its stability. This balance is what made Samarkand so difficult to fully understand from the outside. Travelers could enter, experience its beauty, trade their goods, but they rarely left with complete knowledge of how it truly operated, because the system was layered, visible on the surface, structured beneath it. As the afternoon light softens, the colors of the city deepen. The blue domes take on a richer tone, the shadows stretch across the ground, and the architectural details become more pronounced. From higher vantage points, the layout of the city becomes clearer. Roads lead inward, converging toward central spaces. The design is not random. It directs movement, guiding people where they need to go, while limiting where they do not. It is control without confinement, a system that allows flow, but never loses oversight. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to shift. The intensity of the day fades, replaced by a calmer energy. Markets slow, conversations continue in quieter tones, and the city transitions into a more reflective state. Lights begin to appear, illuminating key spaces while leaving others in shadow. It creates a contrast that feels intentional, reinforcing the idea that not everything is meant to be seen at once. Even at night, Samarkand does not lose its structure. It simply reveals a different layer of it. Looking up, the sky stretches above the city, clear and expansive. It is the same sky that once watched over countless travelers who passed through, each one carrying a piece of the world with them. But not all of those pieces left unchanged. Because within the city, movement was never just allowed. It was shaped, and that is what made Samarkand one of the most powerful places along the Silk Road. Not because it controlled people directly, but because it understood how to control the flow of everything that passed through it. And as you stand in a place where beauty, knowledge, and strategy were woven into a single system, one realization becomes impossible to ignore. Samarkand was never just a destination. It was a filter through which the Silk Road itself had to pass. What if I told you there's a city where time didn't just slow down? It was carefully preserved. A place where knowledge was protected not by secrecy alone, but by repetition. Where traditions were not written to be remembered, but lived so they could never be forgotten. A city that didn't need to hide behind walls, because its true strength was something far more difficult to break. This is Bukhara, a place where the Silk Road was not just passing through, it was being quietly sustained. Unlike cities that dazzled with scale or controlled with structure, Bukhara operated differently. It did not rely on overwhelming presence. It did not need to dominate the landscape. Instead, it built something far more enduring: continuity. Because along the Silk Road, movement was constant. Travelers came and went, routes shifted, empires rose and fell. But for the system to survive, something had to remain stable. Bukhara became that stability. As the first light touches the city, its form begins to reveal itself slowly. There are no sudden displays of grandeur, no overwhelming structures demanding attention all at once. Instead, the city unfolds in layers. Narrow streets, enclosed courtyards, structures that feel connected rather than isolated. It is a city designed not for display, but for function. Walking through Bukhara feels different. The pace changes almost immediately. Movement slows, not because it has to, but because the environment encourages it. There is no rush here, no urgency pushing you forward, because this city was never about speed. It was about preservation. As the day begins, life emerges gradually. Doors open, small workshops come to life, and the sound of quiet activity begins to fill the streets. Artisans take their places, continuing work that has been passed down through generations. The same patterns, the same techniques, the same processes. Not because change is impossible, but because consistency is valuable. In Bukhara, Knowledge is not stored in books alone. It exists in practice, in hands that remember what was taught, in routines that are repeated until they become instinct. And that makes it incredibly difficult to lose. Because even if records disappear, the knowledge remains alive. This is how Bukhara protected something far more important than goods. It protected identity. As you move deeper into the city, the structure becomes more apparent. Religious schools, gathering spaces, marketplaces, each one integrated into the clip time flow of daily life. Nothing feels separate. Everything is connected. And within that connection, information moves differently. Not quickly, not openly, but steadily. Conversations here are not always about immediate exchange. They are about understanding, about maintaining awareness of what is happening beyond the city without reacting too quickly to it. Because reacting too quickly can break continuity, and continuity is everything. As the sun rises higher, the rhythm of Bukhara becomes clearer. It is not defined by peaks of activity, but by consistency. There are no extremes, no sudden shifts, just a steady flow that maintains balance over time. This is what made the city so powerful along the Silk Road. While other places focused on controlling movement or displaying influence, Bukhara focused on maintaining itself, and in doing so, it became reliable. Travelers knew what to expect here, a place where systems worked, where traditions were respected, where life continued regardless of external changes. And that reliability made it essential, because along unpredictable routes, predictability becomes a form of security. As the afternoon light begins to soften, the details of the city become more visible, the textures of walls, the patterns in architecture, the subtle variations that reveal age and use over time. Nothing here feels new, but nothing feels abandoned either. It is a city that exists in a constant state of use, and that continuous use is what preserves it. From higher vantage points, Bukhara appears dense, almost compact. Structures built close together, creating an environment that feels enclosed but not restricted. It is protection without isolation, a way of maintaining identity while still allowing connection. As evening approaches, the atmosphere shifts gently. Activity slows, but does not stop. People gather in familiar places, continuing conversations, sharing meals, reinforcing relationships that have been built over time. The city does not transform dramatically at night. It simply continues, and that continuity is what defines it. Looking up, the sky stretches above, unchanged, while below, the patterns of life repeat in ways that feel almost timeless. It is in this moment that the true role of Bukhara becomes clear. It was not a city that controlled the Silk Road. It was a city that sustained it by maintaining stability in the middle of constant change, by preserving knowledge through practice rather than storage, by ensuring that even as the world shifted, something remained consistent. And that consistency acted as a form of guardianship, not through force, not through restriction, but through resilience. As you stand within a city that has carried its identity across centuries without breaking, one realization begins to take shape, that some places do not protect history by hiding it. They protect it by living it, again and again, until it becomes impossible to erase. What if I told you there's a city that didn't just protect itself? It separated itself from the world? A place where walls were not just built to defend, but to define who belonged inside and who did not. A city where time feels sealed, where every gate once meant control, and every step beyond it carried risk. This is Khiva, a city that turned isolation into power. Long before modern borders shaped nations, Khiva stood as one of the most controlled environments along the Silk Road. It was not hidden deep in mountains, nor lost in endless desert. It was visible, but unreachable, without permission, because Khiva was designed to decide who could enter. As the first light touches its walls, the structure of the city becomes impossible to ignore. Massive barriers rise from the ground, forming a clear boundary between inside and outside. These walls are not symbolic. They are functional, deliberate, and absolute. They create a division that changes everything. Outside the walls, the world remains uncertain. Routes stretch across unpredictable terrain, movement is constant, and control is limited. Inside the walls, everything changes. Order replaces uncertainty. As the gates begin to open with the start of the day, The process of entry is not casual. It is observed, measured, understood. Every person who passes through is no longer just a traveler. They become part of a system that is carefully maintained. Because once inside Khiva, freedom of movement is different. It exists, but within defined limits. The streets are narrower, more structured, guiding movement in ways that are not immediately obvious. Buildings are positioned close together, creating a sense of enclosure that reinforces the idea of containment. This is not accidental. It is design. Walking through Khiva feels like stepping into a controlled environment where every element has a purpose. Towers rise above the city, not just as architectural features, but as points of observation. From these heights, movement can be tracked, patterns can be understood, and the flow of the city can be maintained. Because control here is constant, but it is not oppressive. It is balanced. As the day begins, life inside the walls unfolds with a rhythm that feels contained yet complete. Markets open, artisans begin their work, and daily routines take shape. Unlike cities that depend on constant external movement, Khiva is designed to function internally. It does not rely on outside flow to survive. It manages what enters and what stays. This creates a different kind of stability, one that is not influenced as heavily by the unpredictable nature of the Silk Road. Because while other cities needed to adapt quickly to changing routes and shifting conditions, Khiva could control its exposure. It could limit disruption, and in doing so, it preserved something rare: consistency within confinement. As you move deeper into the city, the sense of separation becomes more noticeable. The outside world begins to feel distant, almost irrelevant. The walls do more than block physical access. They reduce influence. Information still enters, but not freely. It is filtered, and once inside, it becomes part of the city's controlled environment. This is where Khiva's role as a forbidden city becomes clear. Not because it was completely closed, but because access was feel secure. Not because nothing exists outside the walls, but because nothing enters without being known. Looking up, the sky stretches above the enclosed city, a reminder that while the walls define the ground, they cannot contain everything. But below, within those walls, the system remains intact, unbroken. As the final moments of the day settle into stillness, one realization becomes clear. Khiva did not survive by being open. It survived by knowing when to close, by controlling access, by filtering influence, by creating a space where continuity could exist without constant disruption. And in doing so, it became one of the most protected environments along the Silk Road, not hidden from the world, but carefully separated from it. And as you stand within walls that have defined life for centuries, one truth begins to settle in: that sometimes the strongest form of protection is not movement, but knowing exactly where to draw the line between inside and outside. What if I told you there was once a city so powerful, so vast, that it rivaled the greatest capitals on Earth, and then vanished so completely that for centuries it felt like it had never existed at all? Not.
Abandoned slowly, not weakened over time, but erased in a way that left behind silence instead of answers. This is Merv, the lost giant of the Silk Road, where even history struggles to explain what truly happened. Long before its disappearance, Merv was not just another stop along the Silk Road. It was a center of gravity, a place where routes converged, where movement intensified, and where influence expanded outward in every direction. It stood at a critical point between desert and civilization, acting as both gateway and destination. Caravans did not simply pass through Merv, they depended on it, because here, in the middle of an unforgiving landscape, something extraordinary existed: life on a massive scale. As the first light rises over the land where Merv once stood, the silence feels almost unnatural. There are no towering walls still intact, no crowded markets, no visible signs of the energy that once filled this place. Instead, there are traces, subtle elevations in the earth, fragments of structures, patterns in the ground that hint at something far larger beneath the surface. It forces you to imagine what once was: a city filled with movement, streets alive with trade, knowledge flowing between scholars and travelers, a place where the Silk Road reached one of its highest points of activity. But unlike other cities that protected themselves through walls or control, Merv operated differently. Its strength came from scale. It was so large, so active, that it
became difficult to isolate or bypass. It drew people in, not by force, but by necessity. If you were part of the Silk Road, you would eventually reach Merv, and once you did, you became part of its system. As the day begins, imagine the city as it once existed. Gates opening, caravans arriving in waves, goods being unloaded, voices overlapping in a constant flow of interaction. The energy would have been overwhelming, but within that intensity, there was structure. Because even the city of this scale required control. Not the visible kind seen in walled cities like Khiva, but a more complex form. One that relied on coordination, awareness, and balance. Merv had to manage not just who entered, but how everything functioned once inside. Resources, movement, information, all of it had to be maintained at a level that could support its size. And for a time, it worked. The city grew, expanded, and became one of the most important centers along the Silk Road. It was not hidden. It was not isolated. It was fully exposed. And yet, it thrived. But exposure comes with risk, because the more visible a place becomes, the more vulnerable it is to forces beyond its control. As the sun rises higher, the reality of Merv's location becomes more apparent. Surrounded by harsh terrain, dependent on stability, connected to distant regions that could change without warning. It existed within a fragile balance, and when that balance shifts, everything changes. The exact moment of Merv's fall is difficult to fully capture, but its impact is undeniable. A city that once held immense influence suddenly became silent. Movement stopped. Activity disappeared. What remained was absence. And that absence speaks louder than any surviving structure, because it raises a question that defines this entire place. How does something so powerful disappear? As you move through the remains of Merv, the answer does not present itself clearly. There are no complete explanations, no single cause that resolves the mystery. Instead, there are possibilities. Shifting trade routes that redirected movement elsewhere, external forces that disrupted stability, environmental challenges that made survival more difficult. Each one part of a larger pattern, but none of them fully explain the silence, because what truly disappeared was not just the city, it was the system that sustained it. As the afternoon light begins to soften, the landscape takes on a different tone. The remains of Merv become more visible in contrast, their outlines clearer against the surrounding land. It is a reminder that even in disappearance, something remains. Not enough to fully understand, but enough to remember. And that memory becomes a different kind of guardianship, because while Merv could not protect itself forever, its story continues to influence how we understand the Silk Road. It reveals something important, that even the strongest cities are not permanent. That scale alone is not enough to ensure survival. And that sometimes, the greatest loss is not destruction, but disappearance without clarity. As evening approaches, the silence deepens. The land cools, the light fades, and the absence becomes more pronounced. There are no sounds of markets, no movement of caravans, no visible signs of the life that once defined this place. Only space. And within that space, memory. Looking out across what remains, one realization begins to settle in. Merv was not just a city that was lost, it was a warning. A reminder that along the Silk Road, survival depended on more than power or size. It depended on balance, adaptability, and the ability to respond to change. Without those, even the greatest centers could fall into silence. And as you stand in a place where history feels incomplete, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. That some of the most important chapters of the Silk Road were not preserved in walls or cities, but in the spaces where something once existed and then vanished without a trace. What if I told you there's a city where the Silk Road never truly stopped? It just changed its rhythm. A place where trade didn't become history, but continued in a different form. Where cultures didn't fade into the past, but still collide in real time. A city that feels less like a memory and more like a living crossroads. This is Kashgar, where the Silk Road is not remembered, it is still experienced. After the silence of lost cities like Merv, Kashgar feels almost unreal. Not because it is hidden, but because it is alive in a way that defies expectation. Because along a route defined by history, finding something that still moves changes everything. As the first light of day spreads across the city, Kashgar begins to reveal its energy. The streets do not wait to awaken, they are already in motion. People move with purpose, not in a rush, but with a rhythm that feels practiced, almost inherited. This is not a place that had to rebuild its identity. It never lost it. From the earliest hours, the markets begin to fill. Vendors set up their goods, conversations start before transactions, and movement becomes constant. The sound is layered. Voices, footsteps, exchanges happening all at once, but never out of control. Because beneath the activity, there is structure, and that structure has been shaped over centuries. Unlike cities that controlled access through walls or isolation, Kashgar developed a different kind of guardianship. It controlled flow through participation. As you move through the markets, the diversity becomes immediately visible. Goods from different regions, materials that reflect distant landscapes, items that carry stories from places far beyond the city itself. But what stands out is not just what is being sold, it is how it is being exchanged. There is an understanding here, a shared rhythm that does not need to be explained. People know how to interact, how to negotiate, how to maintain balance within the flow of trade. This is not random activity. It is learned behavior, passed down, refined, repeated, until it becomes instinct. And that instinct is what keeps the system alive. Because in Kashgar, the guardians are not positioned at gates or walls. They are everywhere. Every trader who understands the value of what they carry. Every person who participates in the exchange. Every individual who maintains the rhythm of movement. Together, they create a system that is constantly active, yet rarely chaotic. As the sun rises higher, the city expands beyond the markets. Narrow streets lead into residential areas where life continues at a quieter pace. Homes are close together, creating a sense of connection that extends beyond trade. This is where the deeper identity of Kashgar becomes visible. It is not just a place of exchange, it is a place of continuity. Families live here. Generations grow up within this environment, learning not just how to survive, but how to participate in something larger than themselves. Children observe the markets, the interactions, the flow of movement. They do not need formal instruction to understand it. They absorb it, and in doing so, they become part of the system that will continue long after them. As the day progresses, the layers of the city become more defined. The visible activity of trade continues, but beneath it, there is something more subtle. Information moving quietly, not in obvious ways, but through conversation, observation, awareness. Traders share knowledge, travelers bring updates from distant regions, and the city absorbs it all without losing its balance, because balance is what keeps everything functioning. Too much disruption, and the system could fracture. Too little movement, and it could fade. Kashgar exists between those extremes. It allows constant flow, but maintains stability within it. As afternoon light begins to soften, the energy of the city shifts slightly. The intensity of the markets eases, but does not disappear. Movement continues, just at a different pace. This shift reveals something important. The Silk Road here is not dependent on a single moment of activity. It is continuous. It adapts to time, to conditions, to the natural rhythm of the day. And that adaptability is what has allowed it to survive. From higher points within the city, the full scope of Kashgar becomes visible. It is not enclosed like Khiva, not monumental like Samarkand, not silent like Merv. It is dynamic, constantly adjusting, constantly evolving, yet never losing its core identity. As evening approaches, the transformation continues. The markets begin to close gradually, but the city does not become still. Instead, the energy shifts inward. People gather, conversations continue in smaller spaces, and the sense of connection remains just as strong as it was during the busiest hours of the day. Lights appear across the city, illuminating paths and spaces where life continues beyond trade. The atmosphere becomes calmer, but not empty, because in Kashgar, movement never fully stops. It simply changes form. Night brings a different perspective. Sounds carry differently, footsteps become more distinct, and the rhythm of the city feels more personal, more focused. Looking up, the sky stretches above, unchanged, while below, the system continues to function in its own way. And in that moment, something becomes clear. Kashgar did not survive by controlling who entered. It survived by teaching everyone how to belong. by creating a system where participation itself becomes protection, where the more people understand the rhythm, the stronger the system becomes. And as you stand in a place where the Silk Road still moves through everyday life, one realization becomes impossible to ignore: that some cities do not guard history by preserving it. They guard it by living it, every single day, without interruption. What if I told you there's a place along the Silk Road where no city could survive, yet without it, no city could exist? A place so extreme, so unforgiving, that it didn't need walls or gates to keep people out, because nature itself decided who could pass and who would turn back. This is the Pamir Mountains, where the real guardians were not seen, but felt in every step you take. After the movement of cities like Kashgar, the Pamirs feel like another world entirely. There are no crowded markets here, no visible centers of exchange, no structures designed to control flow. And yet, this place controlled everything, because along the Silk Road, there were routes that could not be avoided, paths that cut through the highest and most dangerous terrain, connecting regions that had no other way to reach each other. The Pamir Mountains were one of those places. As the first light touches the peaks, the scale of the landscape becomes overwhelming. Mountains rise sharply into the sky, their edges defined by rock, ice, and shadow. Valleys stretch between them, narrow and deep, creating pathways that feel both necessary and uncertain. The air is thin. Every breath carries a slight resistance, a reminder that this is not an environment designed for ease. Movement here is slower, more deliberate, and that changes everything. Because in a place like this, speed is not an advantage. Awareness is. As the day begins, imagine a caravan approaching one of these routes. Supplies are limited, the journey ahead is uncertain, and the environment offers no guarantees. There are no signs marking the safest path, no clear indicators of where to go next, only experience. And that experience does not belong to the land. It belongs to the people who understand it. Because in the Pamirs, the guardians were not defined by structures or cities. They were defined by knowledge, guides who knew which paths could be trusted, who understood how weather could shift without warning, who could read the land in ways that others could not. Without them, movement would stop. As the sun rises higher, the details of the terrain become more visible: rocks, uneven ground, sudden drops, narrow passes that leave little room for error. Every step requires attention. There is no space for distraction, and that is what makes this place so powerful. It forces focus, because the consequences of losing awareness are immediate. A wrong path, a miscalculation, a delay in movement. Any of these could change the outcome of the journey, and that is why control here feels different. It is not imposed by people, it is imposed by the environment. But even within that environment, human presence remains. Small communities exist in valleys where conditions allow. Not large, not densely populated, but resilient. These are not places of expansion. They are places of survival. As you move through these areas, the connection between people and land becomes clear. There is no separation. Everything is shaped by the environment, from daily routines to long-term decisions. Resources are limited, time is measured differently, and knowledge is everything. Because in a place where the land can change without warning, knowing what to expect becomes the most valuable resource of all. As the day progresses, the light shifts across the mountains, revealing new layers of detail. Shadows move along ridges, highlighting the complexity of the terrain. What once looked like a single path now appears as multiple possibilities, each one carrying its own risks. And this is where the role of the guardian becomes most visible. Not as a figure standing in defense, but as a guide moving forward. Someone who does not stop movement, but makes it possible. As afternoon begins to soften, the atmosphere changes slightly. The intensity of the sun reduces, but the environment does not become easier. If anything, it becomes more unpredictable. Weather can shift quickly here. Clear skies can give way to clouds that obscure visibility. Temperatures can drop, winds can rise, and the landscape can feel entirely different within a short period of time. This unpredictability reinforces a simple truth. Control here is never complete. It is temporary, maintained through constant awareness rather than fixed structures. As evening approaches, the temperature begins to fall. Movement slows, not by choice, but by necessity. The land demands it. Caravans stop. Communities prepare for the night. And the environment transitions into a quieter, more still state. But even in that stillness, the presence of the mountains remains dominant. They do not change. They do not adapt. They simply exist, and everything else must adjust around them. Night in the Pamirs is unlike anywhere else. The sky opens completely, revealing stars with a clarity that feels almost overwhelming. With little interference, the connection between Earth and sky becomes more visible. It creates a sense of scale that is difficult to fully understand. You are small here, and that understanding changes how you see everything. Because in a place where human control is limited, the idea of guardianship becomes something else entirely. It is no longer about protecting space. It is about understanding it. And that understanding becomes the only way to move forward. As the final moments of the day settle into silence, one realization becomes clear. The Pamir Mountains were not just a barrier along the Silk Road. They were a test, a place that filtered who could pass and who could not through force, but through challenge. And those who guided others through it were not just travelers. They were the keepers of possibility, because without them, these routes would not exist. And without these routes, the Silk Road itself would have been incomplete. So, as you stand in a landscape that demands respect at every step, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: that some of the most powerful guardians in history were never seen standing still. They were the ones who knew how to keep moving, even when the world around them made it almost impossible. What if I told you that in the middle of a region shaped by extremes, there exists a place that feels almost impossible? A valley so fertile, so full of life, that it became one of the most protected and quietly controlled regions along the Silk Road, not because it was hidden, but because everyone needed it. This is the Fergana Valley, where abundance itself became something to guard. After the harsh silence of the Pamir Mountains, stepping into the Fergana Valley feels like entering a different world. The air changes, the land opens, and suddenly, where there was struggle, there is ease. Green stretches across the landscape in every direction. Fields move gently with the wind. Trees line pathways, and water flows in a way that feels constant rather than scarce. It is not just a contrast, it is relief. As the first light spreads across the valley, the scale of its fertility becomes clear. This is not a small area of growth surrounded by harsh terrain. It is a vast, sustained environment where life does not fight to exist. It expands naturally. And along the Silk Road, that made it incredibly valuable. Because no matter how strong a city was, no matter how controlled a route became, survival always depended on resources: food, water, stability. And the Fergana Valley offered all of it. As the day begins, movement across the valley starts early. Farmers step into fields that have been cultivated for generations. Their work is steady, practiced, and deeply connected to the land itself. This is not temporary activity. It is continuity in its purest form. The same soil, the same methods, adapted slightly over time, but never disconnected from their origins. And that continuity creates something powerful: reliability. Because along unpredictable routes, knowing that a place can provide what you need becomes essential. But here's what makes the Fergana Valley different. It did not just provide resources. It controlled them, not through force, but through understanding. Communities within the valley knew the value of what they had. They understood that abundance attracts attention, and attention brings risk. So, instead of exposing everything freely, they created systems that balance sharing with protection. As you move through the valley, villages and towns begin to appear. They are not isolated. They are connected through pathways, relationships, and shared practices that reinforce stability across the region. This is not a single center of control. It is a network. And within that network, guardianship is distributed. Each community plays a role in maintaining balance. Each group contributes to the overall function of the valley. Because if one part fails, the entire system becomes vulnerable. As the sun rises higher, the daily life of the valley becomes more visible. Markets begin to form, filled with fresh produce, handmade goods, and items that reflect both necessity and culture. The atmosphere is active, but not chaotic. Movement happens naturally, guided by routines that have been established over time. And within that movement, something subtle takes place. Exchange, but with awareness, because not everything is shared equally. Information, resources, and access are all managed in ways that protect the long-term stability of the valley. This is what transforms abundance into something more than just supply. It becomes strategy. As the day continues, the connection between people and land becomes more defined. There is a rhythm here that is tied directly to the environment. Work follows natural cycles. Decisions are influenced by seasons, and life is structured around maintaining what already exists. This is not a place driven by rapid change. It is driven by sustainability. And sustainability requires protection, not from a single threat, but from imbalance. Too much extraction could damage the land. Too much openness could invite disruption. Too much isolation could limit growth. So, the valley exists between those extremes, open enough to support the Silk Road, controlled enough to protect itself. As the afternoon light softens, the valley takes on a warmer tone. The greens deepen, shadows stretch across the fields, and the full scale of the landscape becomes even more apparent from higher ground. Surrounded by mountains, the valley feels almost enclosed, not trapped, but held. This natural enclosure adds another layer of protection. It limits access, defines pathways, and reinforces the idea that entry into this region is not entirely free. Because even without walls, the valley has boundaries. They are shaped by geography and maintained by people. As evening approaches, the pace begins to slow. The work of the day comes to an end, and communities gather in more relaxed settings. Conversations continue, meals are shared, and the sense of connection becomes more personal. This is where the true strength of the valley becomes visible, not in its resources, but in its people. Because it is their understanding, their consistency, and their ability to maintain balance that keeps everything functioning. Without that, abundance alone would not be enough. As night falls, the valley transitions into a quieter state. Lights appear across villages, creating a soft glow that reflects life continuing in smaller, more contained spaces. The sky above fills with stars, while below, the land remains steady, unchanged in its purpose. And in that stillness, a realization begins to form. The Fergana Valley was not protected because it was hidden. It was protected because it was essential. And anything essential must be guarded carefully. Because once something becomes necessary for everyone, it also becomes vulnerable to everyone. And as you stand in a place where life thrives in the middle of extremes, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: that some of the most powerful guardians in history were not protecting walls or cities. They were protecting the source of life itself. What if I told you the most dangerous thing carried along the Silk Road was never silk, gold, or spices, but ideas? Invisible, unstoppable, and impossible to control once released. Ideas that could reshape empires, challenge belief systems, and change how entire civilizations understood the world. And hidden within the flow of trade, there existed something even more valuable than goods: forbidden knowledge. Because once knowledge begins to move, it cannot be contained. After the physical landscape of cities, mountains, and valleys, this chapter reveals a different layer of the Silk Road, one that cannot be seen with the eye, yet influenced everything: the movement of ideas. Across cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, knowledge was not just created, it was transformed. Scholars gathered, not only to study, but to interpret, refine, and pass forward what they understood. But here's what made this movement complex. Not all knowledge was meant to spread freely. Some ideas were powerful enough to disrupt the balance that cities worked so carefully to maintain. Beliefs that could challenge authority. Discoveries that could shift influence. Information that, once shared, could not be taken back. So, knowledge, like trade, became something that had to be managed. As the first light of this chapter unfolds, imagine a different kind of exchange taking place. Not in open markets, but in quiet rooms. Not through visible goods, but through conversation, teaching, and memory. This is where the Silk Road becomes something more than a trade network. It becomes a network of thought. In places of learning, knowledge is structured, organized in ways that allow it to be understood and preserved. But beyond those spaces, knowledge moves differently. It travels with people, carried in memory, shared in conversation, adapted to new environments. It changes as it moves, shaped by those who receive it. And that makes it unpredictable, because once an idea leaves its place of origin, it begins to evolve. As the day begins, imagine a traveler arriving in a city, not just with goods, but with stories, information about distant lands, new techniques, unfamiliar beliefs. These stories do not stay isolated. They spread, quietly at first. One conversation, then another, shared between individuals, then within groups. Over time, what was once new becomes integrated into the existing system, but not always without resistance, because some ideas challenge stability, and stability is what keeps cities functioning. So the guardians of these cities faced a different kind of responsibility, not just protecting physical space, but deciding how knowledge should move within it. As the sun rises higher, the process becomes clearer. Knowledge is not blocked entirely. That would stop progress. But it is not allowed to spread without awareness either. It is filtered, discussed, interpreted, sometimes restricted, sometimes encouraged, because the goal is not to stop knowledge. It is to manage its impact. In cities like Khiva, control over entry also meant control over information. What came in could be observed before it reached deeper into the system. In more open environments like Kashgar, knowledge moved more freely, but still followed patterns shaped by culture and interaction. And even in remote regions like the Pamir Mountains, knowledge existed in a different form. Survival knowledge, passed carefully, because sharing it incorrectly could lead to loss rather than gain. Everywhere. Along the Silk Road, knowledge took on a different role, but in every case, it required guardianship. As the day continues, you begin to see how deeply this invisible layer influenced everything. Trade routes were not just physical paths, they were also channels for ideas. And sometimes, the ideas were more valuable than the goods themselves, because goods could be replaced. Ideas could not. As afternoon light softens, imagine the accumulation of knowledge over time, layer upon layer, each generation adding something new while preserving what came before. This creates a complex system where the past and present exist together. But it also creates risk, because as knowledge grows, so does its potential to disrupt. And that is where the idea of forbidden begins to take shape. Not necessarily illegal, but sensitive. Knowledge that is not shared openly, not because it is wrong, but because its impact is uncertain. Ideas that are passed only to those who understand their weight. Information that moves quietly, without drawing attention. This is the hidden current of the Silk Road, a flow that exists beneath everything else. As evening approaches, the visible world begins to slow. Markets close, movement reduces, and the noise of trade fades. But the movement of knowledge does not stop. If anything, it becomes more focused. Conversations continue in smaller spaces. Ideas are discussed in quieter tones. Understanding deepens in moments that are not visible to the outside world. This is where knowledge is refined, where it becomes something more than information. It becomes meaning. As night falls, the world grows still, but the presence of this invisible network remains. Ideas carried across distances, shaped by time, protected by those who understood their value. Looking up at the sky, the stars feel distant, yet connected, much like the flow of knowledge itself. And in that moment, a realization begins to form. The Silk Road was never just a path for goods. It was a path for transformation, a system where ideas moved, evolved, and reshaped the world in ways that could not always be seen immediately. And the guardians of that system were not just protecting cities, they were protecting the balance between knowledge and stability, because once that balance is lost, the consequences are not limited to one place. They spread. And as you reflect on the network that carried not just materials, but meaning, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: that the most powerful forces in history are often the ones you cannot see. But once they begin to move, they change everything. What if I told you the Silk Road was never actually built by empires, and it was never truly controlled by kings? What if the real force behind it was something far quieter, far more human, and far more powerful than any army or border? Something that doesn't appear on maps, but still connects the entire world. Because after all the cities, mountains, valleys, and hidden routes, there's one truth left standing. The Silk Road was never a road at all. It was a relationship between people, distance, and time. And the real guardians were never in one place. They were everywhere. As this final chapter begins, everything we've seen starts to overlap. The silence of places like Merv, the order of Samarkand, the continuity of Bukhara, the enclosure of Khiva, and the living flow of Kashgar. All of it begins to merge into a single pattern, not separate stories. One system, a system built on movement. As the day opens, imagine standing above the entire Silk Road not as a line, but as a web. Paths stretching in every direction, crossing deserts, climbing mountains, entering valleys, passing through cities that rise and fall over centuries. But nothing in this system works alone. Every point depends on another, and every connection depends on trust. Because movement is not just physical, it is relational. A caravan does not move without permission. A merchant does not trade without recognition. A traveler does not pass without acceptance. And that acceptance is not written in law alone. It is maintained through repetition, through shared understanding, through behavior passed across generations until it becomes instinct. This is what held the Silk Road together. Not one ruler, not one empire, not one moment in history, but countless small decisions made by ordinary people. As the sun rises, think of the scale of this system. Not just cities interacting, but entire regions depending on each other without ever seeing the full structure they are part of. A city produces knowledge, another preserves it. A valley provides resources, a mountain pass enables movement, a market distributes exchange, each part unaware of the full shape, but essential to it. And that is where the idea of guardianship becomes complete, because the Silk Road was never guarded in one place. It was guarded in many forms at once, in cities that filtered movement, in valleys that sustained life, in mountains that tested endurance, in markets that balanced exchange, in people who carried memory forward. Even disappearance became part of the system, because when cities like Merv vanished, they left behind lessons. When routes shifted, they created new patterns. When knowledge moved, it reshaped understanding. Nothing was truly lost. It was transformed. As the day continues, the Silk Road begins to feel less like history and more like structure. A system that adapts instead of ending, that shifts instead of disappearing. That continues as long as movement exists, and movement has never stopped. It has only changed form. Caravans became ships. Ships became trains. Trains became planes. Physical exchange became digital exchange. Information now moves faster than ever before, crossing boundaries that once took months or years to reach. But the principle remains the same. Nothing moves alone. Everything depends on connection. As afternoon light softens across the imagined landscape of the Silk Road, the idea of distance itself begins to feel different. What once felt vast and separated now feels like a continuous flow, because distance was never the real challenge. Connection across distance was, and that connection has always depended on trust. Trust between people who may never meet again. Trust between cities that depend on each other. Trust between systems that only function when every part participates. As evening approaches, the Silk Road becomes less about geography and more about memory. Memory of roots, memory of practices, memory of decisions that allowed movement to continue for centuries. And memory is what carries the system forward even when physical structures disappear. Because as long as someone remembers how something moves, it still exists. As night falls, the final image is not a city or a mountain or a valley. It is something larger. A network without borders. A pattern without a center. A system defined not by control, but by continuity. And in that silence, one realization becomes unavoidable. The Silk Road was never a line drawn across maps. It was a living agreement between people across time. An understanding that movement creates connection, and connection creates survival. And the guardians of this world were never just rulers or cities. They were the people who kept that agreement alive. Every traveler who continued forward. Every community that supported passage. Every city that allowed exchange. Every memory that refused to disappear. Together, they formed something larger than history. They formed continuity itself. And that is why the Silk Road never truly ended. Because as long as something moves between people, its story is still being written. What if I told you the Silk Road didn't end in the past? It simply changed into the world you live in right now. That every message you send, every product you buy, every idea that travels across borders in seconds is part of the same ancient system that once moved slowly through deserts, mountains, and forgotten cities. Because the Silk Road was never just history. It was the first version of global connection. And it never stopped evolving. After centuries of caravans crossing places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, the physical routes began to fade. Camels disappeared from the horizon. Desert trails became quiet. Mountain passes grew empty. But the system they carried didn't vanish. It upgraded. As the first light of this modern reflection rises, the Silk Road no longer looks like a path on land. It looks like a network across the entire planet. Ports replaced caravan stops. Cities became global hubs. Information replaced silk. Speed replaced distance. But the structure is familiar, because the same rules still apply. Nothing moves alone. Everything depends on connection. In the past, a merchant carried goods across weeks of terrain. Today, a container ship carries thousands of products across oceans. A message that once took months now takes seconds. A trade route that once depended on survival now depends on systems and infrastructure. But beneath all of that, the principle remains unchanged. Flow. As the day unfolds, imagine the modern Silk Road not as a single line, but as overlapping layers. Roads, shipping routes, flight paths, fiber optic cables, data streams, all intersecting, all carrying movement in different forms. And just like before, certain places still act as control points, not because they block movement, but because they organize it. Global cities now play the role once held by ancient centers. Where Samarkand once shaped regional exchange, modern hubs shape international systems. Where Kashgar connected local markets, now entire countries connect through infrastructure and trade networks. The scale has changed, but the structure has not. Even now, information is still filtered, goods are still routed, and movement is still managed. The difference is speed. What once required months of coordination now happens almost instantly. But speed does not remove control. It redistributes it. As afternoon approaches in this global system, it becomes clear that modern connectivity is still dependent on the same invisible foundations. Trust between systems, stability between regions, agreements that allow movement to continue without collapse. Because when movement becomes too fast without structure, it breaks. And that is why organization still exists everywhere, even if it is no longer visible. In the same way it was in ancient cities like Khiva or Bukhara. The form has changed, the function has not. As the world moves through the day, you begin to see how deeply the Silk Road still lives within modern life. A product designed in one country is assembled in another. Raw materials travel across continents before becoming finished goods. Ideas are created in one place and instantly shared everywhere. It is movement without pause, but still governed by structure. Because even in a digital age, systems require balance. Too much disruption affects supply chains. Too little flow slows innovation. Just like in the past, stability depends on coordination, and coordination depends on people. As evening approaches in this global reflection, the connection between past and present becomes impossible to ignore. The same patterns that once shaped desert caravans now shape global logistics. The same need for safe passage now exists in digital security. The same exchange of ideas that once happened in silent rooms now happens across networks that span the planet. The Silk Road never disappeared. It expanded. As night falls, imagine looking at the Earth from above. Light spread across continents like a living map of connection. Cities glowing, routes intersecting, movement flowing continuously from one point to another. It no longer looks like a road. It looks like a system built on the same foundation as centuries ago. Exchange, movement, connection, and still, beneath all technology and speed, the same truth remains. Nothing moves alone. Everything depends on what came before it. The caravans of the past made the networks of today possible. The cities of the Silk Road created the early structure of global exchange. The guardians of ancient routes built the first version of a connected world, and that world never stopped growing. As the final moment of this chapter settles, the realization becomes clear. The Silk Road is not behind you in history. It is around you right now. In every system that moves goods, in every network that moves ideas, in every connection that crosses distance without friction, it is still here, just in a different form. And as long as movement continues, its story will never end. What if I told you the Silk Road was never really a place you could leave behind, because it was never a place at all? What if it was something that survives inside every human decision to connect, to trade, to move, to to share, and to trust someone beyond their own horizon? Because in the end, the Silk Road was never made of sand, stone, or cities. It was made of movement, and movement never truly stops. As this final chapter begins, everything returns to its origin point. Not a single location, but a single idea. Connection across distance. We've traveled through Samarkand, where control and beauty shaped one of the most influential hubs in history. We've stood in Bukhara, where continuity preserved knowledge through centuries. We've seen the enclosed strength of Khiva, the disappearance of Merv, the living rhythm of Kashgar, the survival paths through the Pamir Mountains, and the life-sustaining balance of the Fergana Valley. Each place felt separate, but none of them ever truly were, because they were never isolated stories. They were parts of a single system. As the first light of this final reflection spreads, imagine stepping back far enough to see everything at once. Not cities, not countries, not empires, but patterns. Routes forming where people repeatedly moved. Markets appearing where exchange naturally concentrated. Knowledge flowing along paths of least resistance. Risk shaping where control became necessary. This is what the Silk Road really was. Not a fixed route, but a living response to human need. As time moves forward, you begin to see that every layer we explored was just a different expression of the same principle. In cities, it was organization. In valleys, it was survival. In mountains, it was challenge. In markets, it was exchange. In knowledge, it was transformation. And in people, it was trust. Because none of this worked alone. A caravan did not move without agreement. A city did not function without cooperation. A route did not exist without repetition. Everything depended on something else continuing. That is the hidden architecture of the Silk Road. Not stone, not roads, not empires, but dependency. As the day unfolds into its final stage, the meaning of guardian also changes one last time. At first, guardians were imagined as protectors of cities like Khiva. Then they became maintainers of knowledge in places like Bukhara. Then, guides through extreme terrain like the Pamir Mountains. Then, participants in living systems like Kashgar. But now, the definition expands again, because the final truth is this. The Silk Road was guarded by everyone who participated in it, not by choice of title, but by necessity of action. Every merchant who kept trade fair, every traveler who respected routes, every community that maintained access, every scholar who preserved knowledge, every guide who ensured passage, every city that balanced openness with control. All of them were guardians, even without knowing it. As evening approaches in this final vision, the Silk Road stops feeling like history entirely. It becomes something closer to structure embedded in human behavior. We still repeat it. We still rely on it. We still build systems that connect distance through trust. Only the tools have changed, but the pattern remains. As night falls, the world becomes a map of movement again. Lights across continents, signals across networks, flows of goods and ideas crossing invisible lines. It no longer looks like caravans crossing deserts, but it behaves the same way, because movement still requires coordination, connection still requires trust, and systems still require balance. And in that balance, the Silk Road quietly continues, not as a memory, but as a function. As the final moment arrives, there is no ending in the traditional sense, no final gate closing, no last caravan disappearing into the horizon. Instead, there is understanding that nothing here ever truly ended. It evolved. The Silk Road did not die. It transformed into every system that connects people across distance today. And the guardians did not disappear. They became part of how the world still works. Because as long as something moves from one human to another, the Silk Road is still alive. And it always will be. Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed exploring Prague as much as I enjoyed guiding you through it. If you found this travel guide helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more beautiful destinations from around the world. Got a favorite spot in Prague? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, safe travels and see you in the next video.